All right, perfect. Today me and Emma will be talking about the role of harmful AI narratives, and this kind of comes out of the research that we've both done during our PhD. So we'll be talking about what some kind of really common AI narratives are and the harms that they bring in the sense of kind of becoming self-fulfilling prophecies almost, and then also touching on some best practice cases that have tried to combat these narratives and their effects. Uh, so yeah, before we kind of dive in, I just want to take a minute to talk about why it's important to understand the effects of these narratives. So essentially, these narratives shape our understanding and the general public's understanding of a number of aspects relating to AI. So, for example, think about, AI is going to take over the world and kill everyone, which is not a narrative we cover today, but is a kind of common example of how it can shape the general public's sentiment and how they perceive AI. And these narratives can give kind of untruthful or can give not the full picture of a number of questions, such as who is in control of these systems, who benefits from them, what are they capable of, what should they be capable of, and a number of other questions. And they kind of hijack maybe the truthful or accurate narrative and can spread things like fear of AI or distrust of AI, which can be a good thing in a lot of cases, but it's important that it's grounded in the truth and in accuracy. And then another issue is that they also kind of perpetuate and keep existing power structures going, where they tend to limit the level of participation that underrepresentative groups have in the space of AI. This is because it lowers the perceived necessity to include these groups, but then also because it lowers these groups' self-confidence, that they have the skills necessary to participate and that their voice is valuable and matters, and so on. And so these, like, despite just being narratives, they can lead to a number of very concrete harms. And that's why we wanted to kind of shed light on some of these narratives and the effects they have, and then kind of inspire with some hopeful examples. So I'll cover the first narrative, and then Emma will handle the second two narratives and wrap up the presentation. So first up, we have the whiteness of AI and other structural injustices. So the idea here is that most media representations and real life representations of AI humanoids tend to be white. And this racialization of a technology that we already perceive to be somewhat human-like is firstly a nod to the race of the people who create it in majority, where kind of whiteness creates whiteness. But then also it's a very discouraging barrier for any people of color to kind of break the status quo of AI and get involved in a technology that they feel was not made for them or by them. And it kind of creates this loop almost, or cycle, where there's like a lack of diversity in the space of AI in terms of researchers and professionals. And this leads to a lack of representation of these diverse groups of people's interests and values in the AI being created. This in turn then limits the number of people of color and other unrepresented groups to attempt to then join the AI workforce, and existing power imbalances just keep on kind of perpetuating in this cycle. And it's all rooted in this kind of lack of diversity among AI researchers and practitioners. And because there is such a homogenous group of people building these systems who are very likely to be kind of white males, their representation of the world and the categories that they choose to kind of acknowledge or see in these systems also then become very homogenous and do not represent the complexity and the diversity of the world. And this could be because they are kind of reluctant to tackle this complexity, or it can also be because they are not even aware of this complexity. And this is described using the term privilege hazard, where someone who has privilege isn't necessarily aware that other people around them do not share the same privilege and do not kind of experience the world in the same way. And yeah, our best practice example for this particular narrative is I'm More AI. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Essentially, it focuses on documenting and processing cases of gender-based violence in Latin America. And the interesting aspect as well is that it's created by an all-female team. And it kind of shows how non-traditional AI professionals can create AI systems that focus on very critical, very important use cases that might otherwise be very much overlooked. So yeah, that's our best practice example. And now I'll kind of give the mic over to Emma to keep going.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the second narrative, which is technological determinism, which is kind of the story that technological innovation is, it's inevitable and it's coming and it will shape our society and there's nothing we can do about it. Even though this kind of really neglects that actually, like, I mean, technology is built by humans, right? And humans are part of society, and also societal needs and regulations can shape how technology is developed and what it's allowed to do and what it's not to do. Yeah, and this narrative has several negative consequences. One of them is that it is often used by big tech companies to kind of argue that they're just building this technology because it's going to happen anyway. Like there's always this like kind of killer argument that like someone else is going to do it. And then also saying like, oh, but it's not really our accountability or responsibility because yeah, it will happen anyway. And we're just like kind of in this wheel doing what needs to be done. And also kind of emphasize that it's kind of like neutral. Like for example, Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg said in all these like trials that were going on, he said like, oh, we're just like connecting humans in the way that like, yeah, we need to use technology to connect humans, and kind of completely neglecting that the way they design the platform actually like shapes how it's used. But yeah, basically he's neglecting all this responsibility. And that's also a problem because it frames people developing AI systems as kind of like serving the greater good and like no one can stop them, which is a massive problem because this makes people stand less in their way. Yeah. And the example we brought is on the next slide. Yeah, and this example is from the EU. And when they were shaping their AI policy, they involved various stakeholders and also allowed people like everyone, every citizen, to log into their forum and comment and discuss around policy suggestions. And this kind of counteracts this narrative by saying, I mean, at first, every type of AI policy that kind of limits how it's developed is against this narrative, but then also saying we as society and everyone in the society actually should have a say in how this is developed and we can actively shape it. The third and last narrative is the AI race. And this is the story that there will only be one winner, and the country that's first will get all the progress and all the money, and no one else can catch up. And this is, yeah, partly caused by the belief that if you're the first company or country, then you have all the data, and then you can build more and more accurate systems, and then no one else can catch up. And I mean, this is clearly not true. Because not only accuracy matters, and I don't know, for example, Twitter used to be huge, and now there's certainly space for other players because of specific decisions that weren't at all connected to accuracy. Or I don't know, OpenAI, I guess, wasn't around. So I don't know, innovation always continues and it's always shifting. But this is a really, really harmful narrative. There, especially because it kind of says we don't have time to reflect, we don't have time to consider other opinions, we don't have time to involve stakeholders because that's messy, it takes time, it's hard to fit into a Scrum structure. you don't know what you will get back, so you can't really box it really well. So it doesn't fit in the normal development process of technology. And then secondly, well, if you do this like, okay, let's move fast and break things, then turns out you break things. And when this happens, then there's actually really passive measures like, oh, okay, let's make a rule now after we caused this harm that we don't cause this harm again. But this is like a very passive approach that kind of has this mindset of, yeah, now if we don't do this again, then we're fine. Instead of saying, okay, let's actually actively try to prevent harm by thinking about it first and reflecting about what we're building. So it's kind of related to the first one I spoke about. Yeah, and generally this just can lead to quite harmful perceptions of what the responsibility of AI practitioners is, and also that kind of reflection is kind of like a disadvantage because it costs time. Yeah, and then the examples we brought, I won't go into them into too much detail, but feel free to check them out. They're online and free available, and they're tools, and in this case, set of cards. Okay, can I go? Yeah, exactly. That enable teams of AI practitioners, either just themselves or with their stakeholders, to reflect about what they're actually doing and harms they might create that are kind of away from their radar. And especially the blind spot cards on the right, like each card represents like a blind spot, something they might have overlooked, or harm they might cause, and then forces them to see, oh, might this actually apply here? And then the summary. So we covered that these narratives can shape our beliefs or the beliefs of society about who is in control and who should benefit from AI, and also for what AI gets developed and for what it doesn't get developed. So it's like, who does it serve in a way? And then these kind of preconceptions to these questions can really harm how we develop AI. Because it kind of shapes the agenda, right? It removes the agenda away from like kind of a very human-centered or society-centered approach. And kind of maybe to quickly summarize this, it's from the first harm, it excludes people from feeling represented, but also from actively participating because they just feel this is not a world where I'm involved in. Then the second one kind of reduces accountability from people developing AI, and it kind of also minimizes intervention because it says, oh, it's going to happen anyway. And then the last one kind of hinders reflection because of this race narrative. So, and the problem is that all these three kind of mechanisms, they distract from actually looking at the real problem behind AI, and that's more that it reflects or perpetuates existing inequality. So to actually really build responsible AI, we need to look deeper and understand the socio-technical problems around where we're creating or developing an AI system. Yeah, so instead, we should kind of counteract these narratives, and we discussed some examples to this. But I mean, there are numerous more. I mean, even as a woman in AI, maybe going to a conference in like a flower dress and like not hiding that you're a woman and saying, I'm actually like, I claim this space, I belong here, and we all should shape this. It's like a very small way of doing this. So there are numerous ways. Get creative. Feel free to ask questions. That's it for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Sorry, I'm trying to navigate Zoom. It's being a bit glitchy. Okay. Trying to spotlight myself now. Okay, okay, there we go. Figured it out. Cool. Thank you both so much for this. As you were speaking, I kind of thought of some questions that I wanted to ask to both of you. The first one being about stakeholder involvement. You mentioned a bit of stakeholder involvement. It's kind of just intuitively intertwined with everything, but I'm wondering in which of the narratives maybe do you see stakeholder involvement being like the best so far? Like maybe having the best practices, like even if it doesn't have that many, is there one narrative that you think is being addressed best with stakeholder involvement or doing the best job at stakeholder involvement, even if it's not that good? And then which one do you think is the narrative that's kind of doing the worst at getting stakeholder involvement?
I guess they're all pretty horrible for it. I guess that, I mean, the first narrative around like the whiteness of AI, I guess it just excludes represented groups from like participating in the development, which doesn't mean that they don't necessarily do stakeholder involvement further down the line. But if they would have properly done it, then we probably wouldn't have this problem, because then they would be aware of more perspectives. So I think it's more a symptom in a way, but then because of this vicious cycle, it also causes it. Yeah, in the technological determinism, I mean, it just completely ignores that anyone, like that society can shape technology. So I guess that's pretty bad, because yeah, it just says we don't have a voice. So it's kind of like exactly the opposite of saying, okay, we need to do thorough stakeholder involvement. Yeah, and then the AI race narrative obviously just says, well, we don't have time. As simple as that. We can't afford to ask people. So it's not necessarily against it, it just says we have other priorities, and that is speed.
Yeah, I think also just adding on to what Emma said, I think from like my experience, it seems like the whiteness of AI problem is the one that people tend to focus on, at least in like research or academia. So I work with conversational AI, and I see a lot of papers that are like, we collaboratively designed this with migrants or criminals or victims, or so they're always trying to kind of seek out maybe potentially marginalized or underrepresented groups and kind of include them in studies, which is great. But then there's a lot of questions about how well that kind of generalizes into broader impact. So I guess, yeah, I'm starting to see kind of a bit more involvement in the research space, but then, yeah, I mean, Emma knows more about the industry space, I think. But yeah, I think there's much less there.
Yeah, or very limited of, I mean, there are a lot of companies that think they follow best practices, but that often means they involve their revenue critical users quite a lot, but not necessarily anyone else. But they're also not aware that they should, really. It was actually really
interesting. That's true. It's always like someone else's job.
Yeah, and I interviewed some people, and there were some industry practitioners that were really convinced that it's important, but they thought it's their personal agenda. They really weren't aware that that's like a thing that, like, I don't know, the UN or OECD put policy documents out that say you should do that, but they were just like not aware, which is actually really interesting.
That is interesting. I feel like that's almost like a flip when it's their own personal agenda and they're not aware of the entire infrastructure around trying to get these like human rights or feminist approaches in tech. And then other people are sometimes the opposite, where they're like, well, I don't really care, but I've heard all about these fairness toolkits or like bias, whatever. So it's interesting. Yeah. I guess since you've both been working on these topics, or like since you've had exposure to your first time thinking about stakeholder involvement, like no matter when that necessarily was, from then to now, have you seen any changes in like the culture, both within academia and industry, maybe like from however many years ago that was, or if it was recent to now, if there's even just any little changes you've noticed in the culture, whether that's for better or for worse when it comes to these narratives?
I think in practice, it's like in industry, it's still like shockingly little arrived. I mean, we were at the AI for Good conference, and I think you saw like that most robots were like very attractive women, and there was only one was a man, and he just looked smart and was for education, whilst all the women were for care work or becoming a pop star, or other really useful use cases. So yeah, so that's yeah, that is quite shocking. And then in academia and policy, I feel that especially in academia, maybe in the last 1 year, the voice got stronger and stronger to say, okay, we actually because I don't know, in like this whole like ethical AI debate, there's so much like interpreting ethical values, and there's more and more, I think, the feeling that this shouldn't be done from the outside, that should be done from the people that will be affected by it. So there is more and more and more work on stakeholder involvement, and I've just analyzed some policy documents from like major players in the AI space, like intergovernmental organizations especially, but also NGOs, and other like research institutes. And it's really interesting to see that stakeholder involvement is nearly everywhere, but it's also always on a really high level, and it's sometimes, even as a reader, really hard to know who they mean as stakeholder. So I think there is an awareness that some of it should be defined internally, but there's still very little awareness on how to do this in practice. But I guess the first step is done, and now we need to figure out how to do it in practice. And then, and I think before that is done, it really can't go into industry too much, because if it's on a really theoretical level, like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, Emma said that really well. I don't have much to add. I think just kind of one thing I had noticed when interviewing people who, again, kind of work in conversational AI, I get this feeling that it might be a bit better in the space of conversational AI, because people kind of have this realization that, you know, there's no graphical user interface. We really need to understand like how different people speak, the terms they use and slang and everything, or else you're gonna like have a horrible experience, basically. So I do see a bit more kind of stakeholder involvement there. And I guess, yeah, I feel like a lot of times we just say AI and just clump everything together, but we do kind of forget that there are so many like different types of systems and contexts, and maybe some are doing better than others. But yeah, that's just a thought.
Yeah, really interesting. Especially because I think, or I guess that conversational AI is more on the, I mean, it's more in the human emotional side of AI. So there is probably especially important.
Yeah, makes sense.
Nice. And then I have a pretty broad question in terms of these narratives, which you do touch on. So you mentioned a narrative and then best practices. I'm wondering if there's any other, there's a term I came across that I really like a value lever or value lever of like getting technologists to think about values, essentially like pull the lever and get them to think about this. Like, for example, the MIT blind spot cards could be like a lever of sorts. Are there any other things that you think of kind of off the top of your head right now that you think is a lever that should be implemented to help people to think about these things? And also that maybe expanding beyond just technologists, but addressing these narratives, maybe there's other people like politicians or policymakers or teachers that you feel there's some sort of like lever to get them to think about these values and these topics.
Yeah, I mean, that's largely what my PhD is about, just kind of how do we bring values into things. So I think there's no kind of easy answer. At least I've kind of wasted 2 years looking at this. But yeah, I think there's no kind of short answer to that. I think making it explicit at least, so maybe you don't have to kind of change the whole design process and change like everyone's workflows, because as Emma mentioned, there's already kind of a bit of resistance towards like from tech people towards, you know, ethics and, oh, we have to involve people, and people kind of see that as a burden or extra work that they have to take on. So it's not necessarily about kind of adding more to their list. I think it's more about finding ways to build that into what they're already doing and what exists, so that it can be as kind of less disruptive as possible. I think very practically speaking, that's the way to get it in there and get it accepted by these people. How to do that is another question. Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that yet.
Yeah. Not like 100% directly to this, but I think that generally like no human wants to fully cause harm. And I think the big problem is the feeling of responsibility. Because yeah, I think that is just a really big issue, that people just push away the responsibility. But if you actually explain to them that, for example, math isn't neutral, something we're trying to do with the online course we're currently developing at AI Inequality that will go online soon, or like in a month. That is more, yeah, that is really saying, okay, even though you look at, for example, fairness metrics, they're not equal. They use different definitions of fairness, and to choose the right one or the best one for your context, you need to really understand the context first and existing inequalities. So I think if people are really aware of the responsibility they have, they would maybe more actively search out values. And I think the current resistance comes from, I don't know, just chucking a few ethical values at developers, and then they're like, yeah, okay, like I don't disagree, and I'm sure they don't disagree, but they also don't really know what that means. And I think no one is like, I don't know what that means. And I think I would feel really similar if someone says, okay, now like do this, and it's like, yeah, like fine, like this is all good values, sounds great. And then, but then it doesn't go really further than this. So I think probably one of the really important things is kind of tell people about the responsibility they have, make them aware, and then give them the actual tools to be able to do this. And I think values, honestly, in a way, I think people, or most people, hopefully, already have a specific set of values and don't really want to cause harm. It's just that, yeah, partly these narratives that we just discussed kind of created this like weird atmosphere and culture where it feels like it's not my job, I don't have time, I would like to if I could, but I don't have the buy-in or the resources. And that's really something I heard very often in the interviews, up to like one guy quit his job twice because it was really bad, but it's also like he can't keep quitting. Yeah, so it's more about, yeah, changing the culture, making people aware, and then giving them the tools to actually follow on their values, because I think there's no point in them feeling responsible and wanting to follow values if no one knows how to actually do this in practice. Sorry, this is a very long-winded answer.
I mean, they are, like Malak said, like very difficult questions without much of a direct answer.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how much what we're discussing now is maybe different or similar to a human rights-based approach. So like these narratives that we're discussing and these issues, maybe how might this conversation differ or compare to a human rights-based approach?
Yeah, I think it's just counteracting it, really, because it is excluding people and it is excluding reflection and participation, which is kind of at the core of the human rights-based approach. So, yeah, I think they're more like, yeah, they're just like harming it or minimizing it. Yeah.
I think, yeah, from like a values perspective, if you take like the set of human rights to be like a list of values, I guess it's more than that, but if you reduce it to that, I think at the core of it, it's just like AI professionals have their own set of values. So it could be things like performance, efficiency, time constraints, etc. And then you have human rights as a kind of very high level value that everyone should essentially kind of aim to achieve. And then you have organizational values, you have the values of the people using the AI. And I think at some level, it's just the lack of alignment between all those different kind of sets or lists of values. At least that's how I kind of think of it, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And then that these narratives kind of enhance counteracting values in a way.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering too about the info cards, specifically like the blind spot cards. I remember in my undergrad taking a course on like technology and development and like policy stuff, and it was a course that most of the people there would agree on all the topics we're speaking of, and we had a module on these info like blind spots and stuff like that. And ever since I've had that kind of module, I've always wondered how effective it is in practice, and if either of you know any information on kind of the usability of these cards, or maybe if any studies have even been done about like how many teams are using these cards. That's a very large study, but essentially like what is their perceived effectiveness by technologists, or is there any statistics or data on how many like AI teams actually are picking up these cards and using them?
Yeah, that's a massive problem. There is no study, I think. Yeah, generally, I mean, there's, I think, one. So, I mean, most tools get developed and then around a third of them has an evaluative case study where they get tested, but that's only a third, I would say. And then there's one single study that studies the use of the Google AI, how's it called, Human and AI or something? They have like a whole
People
book.
plus AI.
Yeah, so there's
People
one
plus
study
AI, I think, yeah.
evaluating this one, and that's really interesting because it shows that a lot of people actually use things that are in there to show them to their managers to get the time to actually take time to reflect and involve stakeholders. But I don't know any of the blind spot cards. And I agree with you that the blind spots cards also are on a very abstract level, but then even if they prompt just like some sort of consideration, but I think probably the really hard bit is after you've done it to then tie it into your actual work practice to actually make it relevant to you, to your project. But no, I don't know. I'm sorry. I've used them in workshops to discuss the cards, but I've not actually used them with a team working on a specific AI system for that specific AI system.
Yeah, I think I have the same experience.
Yeah, I think they're probably really aware to raise awareness about these blind spots generally. But then, yeah, I think the big risk is that people don't tie it in with, oh, that actually also applies to like my work. Yeah.
I think as well, because there are so many now, it just also becomes kind of like, why should I use this one and not that one? And because, like you said, like the majority of them aren't evaluated, or even kind of it's not very specified when you should use this as opposed to that. And it's just really confusing. I think even when we were like looking at them for doing studies and things, it's always this question of like, how do we justify that we've used this one and not that one, for example, besides like this is what we came across. Yeah, definitely tricky.
Yeah, you sent me this really cool link of this library now. There's a library of all tools. I'm very glad that it exists. It's very yeah, really, I mean, decks of cards, there must be like 50 out there. No, it's probably exaggerated, but it's a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot too. And like, even I feel like so many people in that class that I had with these cards, so many people were already people that have been thinking about these human rights and feminist approaches for a long time. Even they were like, oh, this is a question I've never thought of. And also it's a way to help organize your thoughts. And I think they're useful ways of thinking. And so I was just interested in seeing as like a greater scope, if anyone knew about the level of their usage, but maybe someone will do a study on that in the coming years. That'd be cool. Cool. So I just have one final question to both of you. So the title of our community publication is Revisions of Now and Future. And we've been talking about kind of the now and how things are now. And I'm wondering, what are your visions of the future? Like, what is a vision you have for tackling these narratives, or just more generally, like what would you want to manifest for a technological and datafied world?
I think one of the ones especially connected to these narratives is that people understand that this is actually made up stories. Like, this isn't necessarily true. There are so many counterexamples to each of these narratives, and yeah, some are even just like not logical. And that people claim their space, claim their voice in this process. And I actually posted something today on the Circle platform, if someone wants to check it out. I think I put it in the Frameworks channel, because it's something I came across. It's an example in LA on the harbor. There was kind of like the business side of things wanted to put more automation, or increase automation, and then there was resistance. And it's illustrated as a comic. It's really digestible. It's very cute, and it really well kind of illustrates how people say, no, accountability is not about the system. It's about you thinking about us. Like, you need to care for us. you have some responsibility, like a moral responsibility. And that's just like one example. It goes through a lot of values and says, and kind of people claim these values for them, like fairness is not your metric, fairness is what you do to me. Yeah, and I just hope that we see a lot more of these. It was really impressive. It was one of the first examples I've seen where that really, I mean, maybe there are more and they don't get put into a nice comic, but that was really, really great. And that would be, I mean, maybe as a user researcher, it's my natural answer to say that people influenced by a system shape it. But living in a democracy kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I feel like I'm always just agreeing with them. But yeah, I echo everything she just said. Honestly, yeah, I think you basically articulated all my thoughts. I don't have much else to add.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you know the Good Robot podcast, but there always is the question about like, what is good AI for you? And I think that would be my answer. So I thought about this, yeah, quite a bit of like, okay, what does actually good mean? And I think good should be defined by the people impacted by it, not by me.
Yeah, I think there's this book that covers something called the value alignment problem, which is essentially kind of largely around whose values should AI align with and similar issues. And I think one like very related thing that comes up in the book is how can we build AI that does what we want when we don't even necessarily always know what we want. And for example, like should it do what we want even if it's bad for us, or should it always do what's good for us even if it's what we don't want? And it's just, yeah, this part of like this messy human experience, and how do you bake that into a machine essentially?
Yeah, it's almost impossible. And Emma, I loved how you mentioned that's a really good way to say it. Like the fairness metrics like aren't for the company. Like essentially like the fairness metric is for us, like for the people impacted, because I think especially for us when we spend so much time trying to get people to take a human rights-based approach or trying to get people to use these fairness metrics, like we turn so much of the attention on them using it that it's like, okay, at the end of the day though, it's about these people. It's not about you looking good and saying you used a fairness metric. So always a good reminder. Cool. I'm going to ask actually both of you if you can talk about your work going forward, and then we'll wrap up. So essentially, where are you going from here? What are you working on? And are you achieving or hoping to achieve any of these visions that you just mentioned?
All right, should I go first? Sure. So yeah, right now I'm just starting the third year of my PhD. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of looking around how do we align specifically conversational AI with all the different values of the different people involved in making it and using it, which is a very broad and big problem space that I've thrown myself into. But my kind of small niche of work on it is working on a framework and a toolkit that comes along with it to help teams to kind of align, or first identify the values involved and then align with them, while also kind of touching on things we mentioned, like how do you make it practical for the tech people and have them like not reject it, and all those kind of different problems that come up. So yeah, right now I'm just working on trying out the tool with teams and seeing the impact it has, etc. And that's largely what I'm working on now.
Really interesting. In the interviews I've just finished, there were quite a few people that said that they get all the stakeholder feedback and then it's really hard to like know what to prioritize and how to align it. So sounds useful. Yeah. My research is I'm at the University of Cambridge, also now starting my third year, and I'm focusing on stakeholder involvement, as maybe was clear from answers, for AI development. And currently I'm kind of wrapping up a study where I investigated first, like what does actually AI policy documents say about stakeholder involvement? And then second, okay, and what's the perception of stakeholder involvement in practice? And kind of what I touched on earlier is that this really interesting tension emerged of like AI policy documents speaking about it in terms of like democratizing the development process, giving everyone a voice. And then in industry, you see this kind of like agile definition, it's like traditional of if you ask your users, you build better products and sell more. you create more value for the user. But it doesn't actually touch on any like bigger societal issues at all. And that some people do want to touch on them, but they think it's their personal agenda. Like half the interviews said, oh, I really want to involve these people, but I don't have the time. And maybe I'm being fussy and stuff. So that's also really interesting. Yeah, and I'm currently in Pittsburgh for a research stay because here is very, very applied research. Yeah, so I hope to join some projects here. Yeah, I think ideally I would like to kind of identify the biggest barriers right now to better stakeholder involvement, and then maybe focus on one or two and come up with interventions, whether that is a tool or whether that is just like some educational material, or I don't know yet. Depends on which issues I'm going to focus on. Yeah, and then test them, because testing them is important. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. I'll open up the floor if there's any final comments either of you want to add. Otherwise, you can go ahead and wrap up.
I have one more comment on the question earlier. I remembered that one of my colleagues did a study that isn't yet published, but he looked at how all these fairness tools get used in practice in industry. And it's very interesting to see that on GitHub or also in practice, you see that after they get released, they get used, loads of people look at them or download them, and then it dies down and they don't get maintained. And basically, after like 6 months to a year, the tool is basically unused, at least for really a lot of them. Yeah, and that was kind of also the insights he got from practitioners, that a lot of people download it, then they open it, then they realize it will take them some time to really understand it, and then it kind of falls under the table. Yeah, it's kind of a sad last thing to say, but yeah, I just wanted to add that.
But your vision
Yeah,
is to fix that. The vision of
yes, exactly. My vision is to fix that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think a lot of stuff like ultimately gets put on the shelf, and I feel like in a way, even with our, or at least like my PhD, there was always this kind of sentiment of, don't create something that, you earn your PhD and then no one ever looks at again. And I'm sure it's the same as well with like the creation of all these tools and methods and frameworks. And I think like the really tricky part is to keep it alive and turn it into something that actually does like real world impact, besides being this like super cool thing. And that's something that's like really important to me. I'm trying to focus on is how do you kind of not only make it theoretically like sound and that if it's used it should make a positive change, but how do you also kind of make it desirable and make it feasible and carve a space for it in existing workflows.
Yeah, very good, very good agenda.
Yes, well, thank you both so much for your time and the wonderful presentation. And I hope we can also keep these conversations flowing online and in other meetings like these ones. And thank you both so much for your contributions. We loved hearing about your work and reading about your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Also, yeah, if anyone has questions or something, I'm on Circle. You can find me online. Just contact me. Happy to discuss.
Yeah, same. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thank you both so much.
Bye.